We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello, and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We've got quite the special lineup for you on today's show because so much is happening across America, specifically in the nation's capital. So we're going to be discussing the rise of the progressive movement currently led by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and ask whether they are actually representative of the Democratic Party or whether they're an insurgent brand, much like the MAGA movement was within the Republican Party back in 2016, and ask whether they actually have the energy, the power to take over the party. We'll also be looking at the future for the Federal Reserve, what's happening with those upcoming rate cuts that everybody's talking about. And also we'll be discussing constitutional amendments, how they happen, and why they keep popping up their ugly heads. All this and more on today's show. And remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by Liberty Nation, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Thanks for being here. And you're on Liberty Nation Radio. I'm Mark Angelides. We're joined by Liberty Nation's editor-at-large, Mr. James Fite. Jim, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Mark. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, what I want to talk about today is there's so much going on with challenges against the Donald Trump administration agenda. And we invariably hear this is unconstitutional. Whether it is or not, I mean, that's a determination for scholars and ultimately the Supreme Court to decide. But you wrote a fascinating piece a little while ago on on the pages of libertynation.com regarding the amendments that never quite made it. And I thought this is an absolutely fascinating topic to get into. So, Jim, give us a brief overview of the constitutional numbers, the amendments, the proposed ones versus the ratified ones, just so we can get an overhead view on it.
Sure. Well, Mark, most people are familiar with the Bill of Rights, of course. Less so most of the amendments, the 17 amendments that came afterwards. But probably very few people are familiar with the 6 amendments that were actually passed by Congress, but never fully ratified by the states. Or, well, I guess that's the debate these days for some of them is.
Well, you're referring here to the Equal Rights Amendment, which seems to raise its ugly head every few years. Well, it seems to be when there's a Democrat in the White House, but let's we'll delve into that a bit.
Yeah.
So there were, according to your article, there's like 11,000 attempted amendments.
Yeah, almost 12, like 11. I think the full number. I went with kind of a vague estimate in the article because there are different
ways of counting.
Numbers, but somewhere around the vicinity of 11,700.
So out of all of these, most have just gone nowhere, and there are 6 that Congress passed. So there's a couple of ways, isn't it, to actually achieve a constitutional amendment. First one being, what's the first one?
All right, so the most common way that this happens is, or sort of the primary way, is for someone to introduce to Congress a bill that is a constitutional amendment. Now, it has to pass both chambers of Congress by a 2/3 majority, right, and then it has to go on. It's sent to the state legislatures, and 3/4 of the state legislatures of however many states you have at the time. So right now we have 50 states. That's 38 states. In the past, of course, there were fewer states and therefore fewer had to ratify. But 3/4 of the states have to then vote to ratify these amendments. And then, of course, the archivist of the United States will then submit it to the Federal Register and it becomes part of the Constitution. The other pathway is for 2/3 at least of the state legislatures to vote to hold what's called a constitutional convention. If at least 2 states vote for that, if at least 2/3 of the states vote for that, then Congress is obligated to hold a convention where it's basically Wild West. Anybody can propose an amendment. It gets a vote on. The state delegates at the convention, then vote on the amendments, and whatever amendments get 3/4 of the state votes, it becomes part of the Constitution. So,
Either way, it's a tricky route to a
yeah,
constitutional
it's
amendment, which
not
is
a
why there's only
why,
27,
almost
right?
12, yeah, almost 12,000 actually introduced to Congress. Only 33 passed by Congress, and of that, 27 became actual amendments.
Yeah, the most recent one being the 27th, which I think is
Which
one of my favorites, which
Mhm.
it's the one that Congress, if they're gonna issue themselves a pay rise, it can't
Yeah,
be for the Congress that they're in.
right. Yeah, no pay raise. Well, okay, so the funny thing is that's actually our founders, like one of the ideas of the founders of
Yes.
the nation. That's in the original in the original draft of the Bill of Rights, it was like 20 amendments. But in the original draft, um the Senate passed there were 12 amendments.
Mm.
And what we call the 27th Amendment now, which was ratified in 1992, was was in that proposed list in 1789. That was Article the Second. It was the original Second Amendment.
So it only took 240 odd years
It took
for them to get around to do it, right?
202 years, I think, from being passed
Oh,
by
yeah,
the
yeah.
Senate to being ratified by the states. Yeah.
So it's a slow process. Now, the reason that this keeps coming up about the ratification process. Well, very quickly, Jim, just give us a rundown, just a bullet point of the six that haven't made it there, the non-ratified
Okay.
amendments.
So the first one is the original First Amendment, which is that the number of representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives would be limited, well, I mean it is limited, but would be set to no more than one representative per 50,000 people.
50,000 people, yeah.
Yeah.
That
Which
that
back then kind of made sense.
yeah.
They didn't go for it, but
There's about
it made more sense
6,000
then.
or so now, isn't it?
6,800 representatives is what we have.
6,800.
If
There you
that
go.
were the case, they're about 310 million people in the
Yeah.
U.S. Something
And
to that
then
effect.
there's one that would have
There's what I call the anti-13th Amendment. There were actually a couple that would have been the 13th Amendment if they
yep.
had been ratified. What I call the anti-13th Amendment, 13th Amendment is so the 13th Amendment is the hey, you can't keep people as slaves amendment, right? Well, what I call the anti-13th Amendment was proposed and actually passed by Congress in 1961. And interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln actually had reached out to state governors and tried to get them to ratify this amendment, not necessarily in support of slavery, but to prevent the Civil War. That obviously we know that plan failed, but that amendment would have made it unconstitutional for anyone to try to amend the Constitution in a way that would prevent that would interfere with states handling their own domestic policies.
Hmm.
And it explicitly says, including, and this is paraphrasing here, but including, it doesn't use the term slavery, but it says including the basically the forced labor
Yeah.
for the state. Which was very clearly, I mean, if you read the the times that this happened in, it was very clearly a protect the state's right to have slavery. But because of the way that it was vaguely worded for political reasons, it would have actually extended out to, oh man, pretty much any domestic policy. I mean, think
Sure.
about, federal gun laws would be null and void if the state differed. Stuff, all kinds of
So
stuff.
there's
Like
ups and downs. There's ups and downs
yeah,
with
yeah,
that
yeah,
one.
no doubt. Like, I don't think, I'm certainly not arguing, oh man, what a
Sure,
shame.
sure.
But
Let's cut that list short. Though. If anybody wants to carry on reading about those, they can go to Jim's article on the page of libertynation.com. Just a final word, Jim. The
yeah,
Equal Rights Amendment that keeps coming back again and again and again. Will it ever be over for that particular amendment?
I don't think it will. And here's why. Um, a lot of these amendments that didn't get ratified are still technically eligible. But because there was no time limit, but the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, had a time limit of 7 years, and it just simply didn't happen. But in 2021, Virginia ratified the amendment, decades too late, and became the 38th state. So some people argue that it's legit. By the wording of its own law, it is not.
I mean, that's also ignoring the fact that several states have actually rescinded their
voted to
ratification of
rescind
it
their
anyway. So it's
ratification.
still not 38. Jim
Yeah.
Fite, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.